chronicler of entrepreneurs and their achievements, there are few who know the Asian startup ecosystem better than Rebecca Fannin. Entrepreneur, author and startup commentator, we caught up with her on her recent visit to India for the launch of her latest book, Startup Asia. The first question we put forth to her, the key differences between the Indian and the Chinese startup ecosystem.
Oh, there's huge differences. I think, for one thing, that India is behind China in the tech ecosystem. It's probably about 6 or 7 years behind. You know, the mobile infrastructure is not as built out. The internet is not as, as many users on the internet. The venture capital scene is younger. The entrepreneurs are really just getting started here in India. I think there's huge promise for Indian entrepreneurs, just like there was for the Chinese entrepreneurs, say, 5 years ago.
Sure. So, Rebecca, you've been a big supporter of China with Silicon Dragon as well. So what really excites you about the Chinese startup ecosystem, and what can Indian entrepreneurs learn from that?
Yeah, well, I think there's just this incredible energy among the Chinese entrepreneurs. It's just so switched on. I've never seen anything like it, not even in Silicon Valley. Of course, there's censorship in China, and you don't have a democratic system. So those are two minuses for China, I think. But if you look at on the startup scene, I don't really think it's holding back the entrepreneurs that much. I think it's more of an outside looking in problem that people say, oh, well, we don't want to go to China because of the censorship there. But for the startup scene, I don't think that they're that bothered by it.
What sort of work does the government do with the startup ecosystem in China?
The government's very supportive, which is a big difference between China and India. So China has all these wonderful technology parks, and they will actually invest in startups. They will recommend startups to invest in for the VCs, for the venture capitalists. And so, they say that in India, the entrepreneurs succeed despite the government, but it's the opposite in China.
So, Rebecca, moving from China to Vietnam and to Japan, where you also spend your time, how would you compare the ecosystem in other parts of Asia? How would you compare those countries with India?
Well, I think China is the giant, India is next, and then you have all these frontier markets. So I think it's really a China-India story. But I am encouraged by what I see in Vietnam, because the Vietnamese entrepreneurs remind me a lot of the Chinese entrepreneurs about 6, 7 years ago. They have the same energy level, they have the same drive. And they have the same, in many cases, the same venture investors.
Sure.
So those venture investors are taking the business models that worked in China and then that worked in India and now into Vietnam. So I think Vietnam is a real frontier market.
Okay, so what are these business models, Rebecca? You've come across multiple business models in multiple sectors. What
Sure.
sort of sectors are taking flight across the Asian region?
Sure. Well, if you look at search, for instance, there's a Vietnamese search company that is trying to be the Google of Vietnam, and so you look in that area. Also, there's another company that's in social networking. Social networking is hot in all three, in most of the markets of Asia. China has Tencent, it has Sina, it has Weibo, so the Twitter, the Facebooks. And in India has some of its own Twitter products, and Vietnam does too. So in the social networking and gaming space. So these are areas that cross borders.
Becca, what do you think is really lacking at some level within the Indian ecosystem? You think India is not perhaps seen as many IPOs or blowout successes as China has, or you think Indian companies take that much longer to scale as compared to Chinese competitors?
Yeah, I think the India story is evolving. I think there is this gap. And I think, companies like Make My Trip, which had a very successful IPO on NASDAQ in 2010, we really haven't seen anyone follow that. There's really been no startup that's followed that. So I think we're on the cusp of that happening. It just hasn't happened yet. So in China, in 2010, there were many more Chinese companies that listed on NASDAQ and the New York Stock Exchange than there were U.S. companies.
Right.
So it's amazing what the Chinese have been able to accomplish in a short period of time. And I think India is just right behind there. It's on the cusp. It's this inflection point. Many
people say that apart from the mentors, it's the investors that make up the ecosystem in a certain country, right?
Yeah.
You've met a number of investors here across the Asian region, India, in China, in Vietnam, in Japan, and so on and so forth. How would you compare the investors and their mindset here as opposed to other parts of Asia?
Well, it's interesting that the same venture capital investors, the same firms, are both in India and China. So you go down the list, there's Sequoia, there's Kleiner, there's Draper, there's NEA, you know, they're all here, and in both markets. But I think the mindset is pretty similar. There might be a little more of an edge, of a philosophical edge here in India.
Okay.
And in China, it's maybe more direct.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
So you're seeing more risk-taking investors in China as opposed to India?
Maybe.
Okay.
Yeah.
Rebecca, you mentioned Vietnam, you mentioned India and China. What are some of the other countries within the Asian region which have some startup activity?
Yeah, I think Singapore does. Yeah. The issue in Singapore is that there's not a domestic market that's big enough that these companies can scale locally. So they have to look outward.
Sure.
But Singapore has all these wonderful incentives for startups.
Sure.
And many of them are driven by the government.
Okay.
So it's a great ecosystem. It's a great place to do a startup and get some, helping hand. So.
Sure. Fantastic. Rebecca, we're nearing the end of this interview. I wanted to put you on the spot and ask you to come up with 3 big predictions from the startup ecosystem in Asia for the next 3 years.
Okay. India begins to catch up with China. China begins to recover from the problems with the scandals over the accounting issues. And the third one is maybe there'll be some interest in Indonesia, and because Indonesia is such a large market, and I'm hearing about things happening there.
Rebecca, we'll hold you to those predictions. Thank you very much for joining us on Starting Up.
Thank you.